Choctaw Bigfoot, Midnight in the Mountains by Tim Tingle. Blame my Uncle Kenneth. Everybody else does. Saturday afternoon, sitting under the trees in the backyard of Mama, my Choctaw grandmother. The family was gathered for our weekly Saturday meal. Dozens of cousins and aunts and uncles and everybody kin to us. Barbecue cooked on the grill, beef and chicken and fat sausage links. My favorite. You know better than to listen to anything that man says, said my mother, sliding the glass patio door open and hollering loud enough for everybody to hear. My little cousin, Cindy, had just run in the house screaming about some swamp creature from Mississippi. What Uncle Kenneth said? I don't care what your Uncle Kenneth says, now or 20 years from now. Uncle Kenneth sat on a chair by the fish pond, with his head resting on his chest. He was pretending to be asleep, but nobody bought it. As soon as Mom stepped inside to check on her pot of beans, Kenneth smiled and waved a finger at me. The other grown-ups looked at each other and shook their heads. That's when you know, really know, you're surrounded by family. Nobody has to say a word. They just look at each other, and you know what they are thinking. I sauntered across the yard like I was searching for fallen pecans on the ground. When I reached Uncle Kenneth, I sat down by his chair and wrapped my arms around my knees. You know, your mother is a smart lady, Uncle Kenneth said. I looked up at him and waited. He didn't say anything, but the way he looked to the house and back at me told me, but she doesn't know everything. He didn't say it, he Choctaw said it. We're Choctaws, and we have our own ways. Trust me. I laughed and nodded a Choctaw yes. So, I already told you about the Bopoli, those Choctaw little people, Uncle Kenneth said. And you know not to trust them. They aren't going to go hurt anybody. No broken arms or sliced off fingers. That's not what they're about. They're funny, aren't they, Uncle Kenneth? That's right, Turtle Kid, he said. The Bopoli like to play jokes, and they can be invisible when they want to. So they're really good at joke playing. You don't mind me calling you Turtle Kid, do you? No, I like that name. Good. That will be your Choctaw name for now. So anyway, the Bopoli were following a family down the road. They might have been driving a wagon pulled by horses, or maybe a car. I can't remember. I think it was a car, because it happened last year, I said. And it was in those Oklahoma Kiamichi Mountains, and it was almost midnight. You know this story? No, sorry, I said, zipping my fingers across my mouth, the Choctaw sign for I'll shut up. Okay then. But it was last year. It was the Kiamichi Mountains, and it was near midnight. So the night creatures were prowling. The driver, Mr. Chukma, pulled to the side of the road. He spotted a clearing under the trees and thought it would be a good place to spend the night. He stepped from the car, getting ready to open the door for his wife and wake up his 3 kids. That's when he heard it. I wanted so bad to ask, heard what? But I'd already zipped my mouth shut. Instead, I leaned forward. Yes, Uncle Kenneth whispered, looking about the yard and making sure nobody else heard what he was about to say. That's when he heard it. I nodded, slowly. Pow! He hollered, slapping his hands together. I fell over backward, and everybody within a mile laughed so loud my mother stuck her head through the back door again. Don't say I didn't warn you, she said. More laughter. Pay no attention to them, Turtle Kid, said my dear uncle. I want this to be a story you'll never forget. I sat up and said quietly, You don't have to worry about that. A shukma, good. Now, where was I? Oh, so Mr. Chukma heard the pow noise and jumped back in his car. He pulled his wife close to him and told the kids to get down on the floorboard and stay quiet. They didn't have long to wait. Mr. Chukma was leaning over the seat and assuring his kids that everything was going to be all right. So he had his back turned to the front windshield. Mrs. Chukma tapped him softly on the shoulder and whispered, "You need to look." Mr. Chukma was about to ask, "What is it?" But he didn't get a chance. He heard a growl so loud, the kids screamed, and Mrs. Chukma screamed, and finally, Mr. Chukma himself screamed. Nalusha Chito, the big hairy man of Choctaw country, stood right in front of the car. Oh no. That's right, Turtle Kit. The big hairy man, Nalusha Chito. That's what we Choctaws like to call him. He circled the car, waving a log so big no human could have carried it. But he swung it back and forth from his shoulder to his palm, slapping it like it was a foot-long ruler, like you have at school. By now, dozens of cousins had scooted around me, sprawled about on the ground and listening. Uncle Kenneth took a long, deep breath, and when he leaned forward again, the world changed. No longer were we in the backyard of Pasadena, Texas, the good backyard of my Choctaw grandmother. No, we were in the dark, deep woods of the Oklahoma Kiamichi Mountains, clinging to each other and praying that the Choctaw Bigfoot, the Nalusha Chito, would please go away. Now, I'm not going to tell you he smashed the hood of that car so hard he cracked the engine block, and they couldn't drive away. But that's what happened. And when he finished with the hood, he flung the log at the windshield, and glass went scattering everywhere. "Oh no!" shouted dozens of cousins. Now, I'm not going to tell you Mr. Chukma and his family lost fingers and eyeballs and noses and ears with all the glass flying about, because that's not what happened. No, they had old Choctaw blankets wrapped around them, so they were safe. Well, not entirely safe. Mr. Chukma flung open his door, and Mrs. Chukma dragged the three kids out of the car, and just in time. Nalusha Chito jumped on the smashed hood and pounded the roof of the car with his log. The Chukmas fled into the woods and hid behind a big boulder. They wrapped one big blanket over themselves and shook and shivered under it. Nalusha Chito climbed from the car and looked for the Chukmas, didn't he? I asked. I was lying on the ground now, with my face buried in the green grass. I whispered so softly, not a single blade of grass moved. "Yes, he did," said Uncle Kenneth. "He ran across the road and struck everything in his way. He knocked down a tree where a mountain lion slept. But even the mountain lion didn't want to fight Nalusha Chito, not at midnight. So he leapt to the ground and ran away. Then everything grew quiet, real quiet, strange and quiet, like you never know living in the city. Nothing moved, no birds, not even crickets chirping, nothing. Nalusha Chito had scared every living thing in those woods, and he liked it. He knew that when the Chukmas moved, even a tiny little step, he'd hear 'em. So he sat down, pulled out a corn cob, and ate a few bites. Uncle Kenneth turned to me and asked, "I bet you thought I forgot all about those Bopoli." I shook my head no, then lowered my chin to my chest and waited. Like the Chukmas, we all waited. Yes, those Bopoli, the Choctaw little people, they always seem to show up when they're least expected. And who's going to be looking for the funny Bopoli when Nalusha Chito is smashing cars and trees and everything in sight? But anyways, They floated above the tree he leaned against. Floated? I whisper asked. Oh yes, Turtle Kid. They can appear and disappear and time travel and do anything they want to, those Bopoli. They floated above him and started making chirping noises, like little birdies. And oh, did that make Nalusha Cheeto mad. He threw his corn cob at the birdies, but they kept on chirping. So he climbed the tree, dragging his log behind him. Halfway up the tree, 30 feet high, the chirping stopped. He grunted a few times and looked up and down and all around. The Bopoli started chirping again on the end of the limb. Now, Nalusha Cheeto, I don't care what they tell you, is not no idiot. No, he isn't. He knew not to climb out on that limb, heavy as he was. But he did scoot a few feet away from the trunk, and he did stretch his log out to the end of the limb. Then he stood up, careful not to lose his balance and fall, and slowly lifted the log over his head, ready to smash those chirpy birdies. That's when they did it, the Bopoli. They started chirping louder than ever from the other end of the limb, the trunk side. And Nalusha Cheeto was so mad, he turned around and smashed the limb he was standing on. Now, I'm not going to tell you he fell 40 feet to the ground and knocked himself out. And the Chukmas heard it all and slept peacefully till morning, when they hitched a ride to town and lived happily ever after. Because that's not what happened, is it, Uncle Kenneth? I asked. No, Turtle Kid. It's never that simple. Not when the Bopoli are involved. What happened? Remember when I said the Chukmas covered themselves with a Choctaw blanket? Well, Mrs. Chukma always carried a few spare blankets in the trunk of her car. And with the car smashed to smithereens, the trunk flew open. The Bopoli spotted the extra blankets, and while one Bopoli was chirping like a bird, the others hurried across the road and grabbed a beautiful blue Choctaw blanket. They flew to the base of the tree and stretched it wide like a trampoline. We all, myself and my dozens of cousins, leaned back and raised our eyebrows in disbelief. Like, okay, never gonna happen. Nalusha Cheeto had to weigh at least 1,000 pounds, and a few little people could never catch him, and bounce him around like a kid on a trampoline. I know what you're thinking, Uncle Kenneth said. You're thinking, how could they cross the road without a crossing guard? We all gave him a great big authentic Choctaw laugh and let him go on with his story. So, when Nalusha Cheeto cracked the limb he was standing on and fell 77 feet to the ground, he spun round and round, brushing away the clouds and swiping at the moon. But nothing stopped his fall. He hit the blanket like a boulder from the sky, as 4 strong-willed Bopoli yanked hard at the 4 corners. Luckily, Mrs. Chukma had a mighty fine recipe for Nalusha Cheeto stew in her cookbook. Unluckily, she'd left the cookbook in their kitchen drawer in McAllister. Luckily, she'd memorized the recipe for just this occasion. Unluckily for the Chukma family, but lucky for Nalusha Cheeto, he did not end up in a stew pot. No, he bounced high in the air, once, twice, 4 times, before settling on the ground, sitting Indian style and very relieved. Uncle Kenneth? Yes, Turtle Kid? What is Indian style? Glad you asked. Indian style means in a chair, like you sit in at school. The Bopoli found a flimsy folding chair in the car trunk and had it ready for Nalusha Cheeto. Okay, just wondering. And once he realized he wasn't going to die, Nalusha Cheeto was madder than he'd ever been in his life. He jumped out of the chair and flung it so high It sailed over the Red River and all the way to the Love Field Airport in Dallas. It came so close to hitting the wing of a plane, it was mistaken for a drone. The Chukmas watched everything, peeking over the boulder and hoping Nolusha Cheetah would live, but maybe be knocked out for a few days. When he stood up, Mr. Chukma hollered, "Balili, run!" And that's what they did, downhill to the state park. Nolusha Cheetah heard the shouting and chased the Chukmas, who ran across the road, first looking to his right, then to his left, to make sure no cars were coming. Paths cut through the trees and made it easier to run, even on a dark midnight. Of course, the path was covered with sleeping rattlesnakes, a family of porcupines, and mountains of scorpions. But nothing serious. But this was a park the Chukmas did not know. They'd never camped here. They only knew they had to make it to park headquarters before Nolusha Cheetah caught them. Mr. Chukma ran in the lead, slapping branches out of the way, lifting and tossing fallen trees stretched across the path. Mrs. Chukma hurried the kids along, trying her best to keep the blanket over their heads. She was scared to blazes, but she acted brave for the kids. All of a sudden, the path split. One fork curved to the left, the other to the right. And right in the middle of the fork stood a tall sign with big letters and an arrow. On any day but today, or tonight, the sign read, "Downhill to Lakeside Picnic Grounds, left," and the arrow at the top of the sign pointed left. But not tonight. You see, those Bopoli were having too much fun to quit. So they switched the arrows, pointing them in the wrong direction. Tonight, the sign read, "Downhill to Lakeside Picnic Grounds, left," but the arrow pointed right. So the Chukmas run faster to the left. When they came to the next fork, the sign read, "Downhill to Lakeside Boat Dock, right," but the arrow at the top of the sign pointed left. Ignoring the arrow, they ran downhill to the right. Finally, after dodging rattlesnakes and scorpions, they spotted the sign they were looking for. Park Ranger Headquarters, downhill right. But the arrow at the top of the sign pointed left. The Chukma family turned right and ran like their lives depended on it. They skidded and rolled and didn't stop till they came to the bottom of the hill. But they weren't safe yet. They still had to cross the picnic grounds and parking lot, and they knew how fast Nolusha Cheetah could run. "He was right behind him," I said. "No, Turtle Kid, he was 2 miles away, running in the wrong direction." "I'm confused," said Trisha, my younger cousin. "Like, duh," said Keith, the smartest cousin. I just sat back without saying a word, folding my arms and Choctaw saying with my pursed lips and tilting head, "Okay, so where is this going?" Uncle Kenneth pretended not to notice me, but I saw a smile creeping over his face. But if the Chukmas were going to make it alive and not into the belly of Nolusha Cheetah, they had to make sense out of this confusion. The big dude was fast and getting close, but he couldn't read, and when a sign pointed right or left, he followed the arrow. Didn't matter what the sign said, he followed the arrow. "How did the Chukmas know which way to go?" I asked, "if the arrow pointed the wrong way?" "Glad you asked," said Uncle Kenneth. "I didn't tell you about the Chukma kids yet. They were smart young'uns, real smart. Mary Chukma was 12 years old, and she loved geography. Whenever they traveled, she always carried a state map, and did it come in handy on this night?" "How could she read in the dark?" Keith asked. "Thank you for asking," Uncle Kenneth said. "Ricky Chukma, Mary's little brother, had a camper's manual, which he had read from cover to cover. He'd advised what to do in case an elusive Cheeto smashed your car and you were stranded in the woods at midnight. He remembered Chapter 2, the importance of flashlights in the dark. So of course he carried a flashlight. With Ricky shining the light and Mary reading the map, the Chukmas knew which way to go. They dashed across the parking lot to the park headquarters, pounded on the door, and a park ranger ushered them inside to safety. "What happened to their car?" Keith asked. "I'm assuming it was totaled?" "You assume right," said Uncle Kenneth. But the rearview mirrors were still good, so all Choctaw State Insurance replaced the Chukma car with a super cool minivan. I couldn't let him get away with that. I covered my eyes with my hands and shook my head, Choctaw telling him, "My mom is right. You can't believe a word Uncle Kenneth says." "Excuse me, Uncle Kenneth," said Keith, and the academic tone of his voice made everyone pause and look his way. "Yes, my nephew Keith, son of my brother Billy," said Uncle Kenneth. "Sarcasm," I whispered in my fists, rocking back and forth. "I am pondering the fate of campers who arrived the next day," said Keith. "Nice families who could not read, or possibly read in another language." "You're forgetting," Uncle Kenneth replied. "Those Bopoli think of everything. They, of course, switched back the arrows. So if there are no more questions." "But what happened to Lelusha Cheeto?" asked sweet little cousin Cindy, waving her tiny little hand in the air. "He is people too." "Glad you asked," Uncle Kenneth said, glancing at his watch and blowing his cheeks into one huge "I am not believing this" Choctaw bubble. "Yes, Nelusa Cheeto is people too, but he found himself running uphill till he came to the 20-foot-long boulder stretched over the lake, 97 feet below. The sign clearly said, 'Do not walk on the overlook. It is cracked and ready to fall, and we do not have the staff to provide a lifeguard if you cannot swim, or even if you can.'" "But Nelusha Cheeto can't read, Uncle Kenneth," Cindy chirped. "No, sweetheart, he cannot." He ignored the warning and stepped onto the overlook. He heard the cracking sound, lost his balance, and fell kicking and screaming into the lake. "Kicking and screaming?" asked Tricia. "It's called a cliché," replied Keith. "I don't like this," said a determined little Cindy. "Wait, hon, it's not over yet," said Uncle Kenneth. "A group of anthropologists, seeking proof that Nelusha Cheeto was real, were paddling their canoe around the lake, when they saw not only the skeletal structure of the creature, but the actual creature. They leapt overboard. Nelusha Cheeto climbed in the canoe and paddled safely to shore." "Why were they paddling around at midnight?" Keith asked. "And did they live or drown?" asked Tricia. "Yeah, Uncle Kenneth, and what kind of creamer did the park ranger serve the Chukmas in their coffee?" I inquired. Uncle Kenneth stood up, looming 6 feet above me and my dozens of cousins. He took a deep breath and bellowed, "The end." Like good little Choctaw kids, me and my dozens of cousins all clapped and slapped Uncle Kenneth on the back. "Good story," we told him. "Wait," he said, holding his palm aloft. "What could the Chukmas do that Nelusha Cheeto could not do? What saved this family's life?" "Turtle Kid knows," I said, raising my hand. "Yes?" I stood up and lifted my palm to Uncle Kenneth in a sign of high respect, then turned to my dozens of cousins. "Our dear and wise Uncle Kenneth has told us a tale full of meaning. The Chukma family can do many things Nelusha Cheeto cannot, but the greatest of these, my dozens of cousins, the greatest of these things is that they can, each and every one of them, tie their own shoelaces." Jaws dropped, and no one said a word. If they couldn't tie their own shoelaces, they would have tripped on the path, and who knows what would have happened. Is there anything else they could do that Nolisha Cheeto could not? Asked Uncle Kenneth. Anything? Well, okay, they could read. Mary Chukma could read, and so could her brother Ricky. They could read in the dark with flashlights. They could read even while they ate hamburgers. And French fries, shouted Cindy, with lots of ketchup. But they were always careful never to drip ketchup on the pages of the book, Keith said. Nobody wants to read a book with ketchup between the pages. I told you never to listen to your Uncle Kenneth, my mother shouted, standing in the doorway with her hands on her hips. Is he telling you to pour ketchup on your books? No, we all shouted, protecting our new and funniest favorite teacher, Uncle Kenneth. Mother closed the door and stepped inside, and I thought, just for a moment, that I saw her smiling. Okay, Uncle Kenneth, I asked, how do you know so much about Nolusha Cheeto? Nolusha Cheeto, the Choctaw Trail of Tears, the Choctaw Code Talkers of World War I know all about Choctaws today and long ago, and other Indian nations too. Anybody want to guess how? Turtle Kid knows, I said. I'm sure you do, said Uncle Kenneth. I'm sure you do. You know all about Choctaws because my mother read to you when you were a little kid. Uncle Kenneth gave me a quiet, are you crazy, Choctaw stare. Then his lips crawled into a grin. Or maybe, he said, I learned to read before I learned to tie my own shoelaces. No way, shouted my dozens of cousins, and we circled my Uncle Kenneth for one big Choctaw hug.